Good morning, students. Today we're going to talk about the other side of the Gilded Age, or kind of what was underneath a lot of the Gild. Miss Brett talked to you last time about the Gilded Age definition being like there was this gold and glitz on top, and underneath of that is like mess and rust and dirt. So it looks really good on the surface, but underneath things have a really big problem. So today we're going to talk about some of that mess underneath. Not all of it was mess, but some of the stuff that they lived in was a little messy. So the Gilded Age in the United States was a time of a lot of immigration and a lot of expansion of our population. Many people, millions it says, were migrating to the United States in search of jobs. When you think about it from a world perspective, in other parts of the world at this time, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of political instability. So people were seeking that stability and that opportunity in the United States. Many of the immigrants were moving to big cities because that's where the ships would land. They would land there and people would end up just settling there, particularly in places along the East Coast and in the Northeast, and then some of the larger cities on the West Coast as well. If they didn't stay there, when you think about how could they get from New York to Chicago, or from New York to another city in farther in, Pittsburgh, something like that, they would have to take trains. So they had to have ways that were easy to get to. So it was really rare for them to end up landing in a smaller community that wasn't easily accessible by larger forms of transportation. Two definitions that we need to note in this unit. An immigrant with a capital I or a lowercase I, an immigrant with an I is someone who comes into a country. They come to live permanently. I, immigrant, I, in. They're coming into a country. An emigrant sounds very similar. An emigrant is someone who is leaving a country. E, immigrant, E, exit. They leave their country to go live somewhere else. When immigrants came to the United States, they were usually traveling in a part of the ship called the steerage, an open area below deck on most of the ships. Passage was more inexpensive down there. They didn't have private cabins for the most part, but they were frequently traveling with a bunch of other people, probably from their same country. When they arrived in a city, many like the United States, they were processed at Ellis Island or at a processing center, Angel Island in San Francisco. 75% of all of the immigrants that came to the United States came in through New York City. 75% got to pass by that Statue of Liberty. Once they came in to Ellis Island in New York City, they had to pass a health examination. They wanted to make sure that no one coming in was sick, and anyone that had a serious problem or a disease would not be let in. Many times they would be quarantined. We understand the definition of that word now. Many times they would be quarantined until they showed no symptoms or they were deemed healthy enough to enter the country. They also questioned the immigrants, questioned the families coming in to make sure that they were not criminals, make sure that they were capable of working, and make sure that they had some money in their pockets, up to $25. If not, we would give them some money to make sure that they could get on their feet and would have a fair start once they entered the United States. That experience on Ellis Island might take a couple hours or even longer. It was not a quick pass-through. It was a difficult process and a long day, particularly after getting off of a ship that you've been on for quite a long time. Once the immigrants got into a city, whether that be New York City or somewhere farther inland, they would kind of congregate together. If you are coming to New York from Germany or Hungary or France, probably not France, Italy, you would, if you were walking around, you would look for something that's familiar to you. So people tended to congregate together, which is how these little pockets like Chinatown or Little Italy started to emerge in a lot of our bigger cities. You can even see that in Austin. There are different parts of our city that have lots of shops or restaurants that cater to one culture. So the same kind of thing is still happening today. When immigrants were then congregated together in these areas, they started to organize themselves. They had power to vote, and if they are congregated in a certain area, they could use their concentration to support different political groups or political policies or politicians. So if they were or not isolated, but if they're contained or congregated or have a higher population density in one area, they could make sure that their issues and that their voice was starting to be heard from politicians because they did have the power to vote. This map shows New York by different ethnic communities. The darker the red, you can see it's more densely populated. So pretty cool graphic to show the population density of different ethnic communities and how closely they stayed together. When immigrants came to the United States, many times it was because they didn't have much money. They were looking for opportunity, they're looking for jobs. So housing was low on their list for being able to financially pay for. So immigrants lived in housing called tenements. You may have learned about these in geography or last year in world history. Tenement style housing was used in many countries all over the world. It was, if you can kind of imagine, a really rundown apartment or an apartment building with like one floor is built just on top of the other as it's needed. There were not a lot of building codes. Like if today in the United States or in Austin, you build a new house, you have different city inspectors or county inspectors come out to make sure that your wiring is safe and that your plumbing is safe and that you have enough 2x4s and that your insulation is away from your wiring. There's all sorts of codes to make sure that our houses and our buildings and our facilities stay safe. Those are these different government codes. Those didn't exist during the Gilded Age. You just had to trust, if you were renting an apartment or getting a place to live, that it was going to be safe enough for your family to live in. Many times it was not. They were really poor living conditions. A lot of times they didn't have running water. Many times they would take a floor of a warehouse and just chop it up into different sections with walls, put up walls, and throw an entire family unit in one. So frequently in a tenement, in its one, maybe a 2-bedroom apartment with an entire family, parents, sometimes grandparents, and also children living in that apartment. Many times they would also use these as a basis for work, particularly for the women and the children who could work at home and then could sell whatever work they were doing, whatever handwork they were creating. These are very, very poor working conditions. In this next picture, I want you to look at, take just a moment, a pause, look at the overview here. What's the perspective of the photographer? I want you to break up the picture into quarters and look at just the top left quarter first. See if you can pick out any details that you didn't see the first time. Then move to the right top quarter. And then down in the left bottom quarter. And then the right bottom quarter. You may have noticed that there were more children there than you first saw. Maybe there's other details that you picked up on, walls that didn't look quite straight or even, dirt in some places. This entire family of 7 probably lived in this one bedroom, or in this one room. You can see over on the left, the older boy has his arm up against something that might be like a sink or a stove. So all of this is taking place in one room. Very, very poor working and living conditions. So what kind of reactions were the immigrants met with? There were 2 different ideas that started to emerge from people who considered themselves native, and I'm going to use that word in quotes, native to the United States. The first is a term called xenophobia. It's known as anti-foreigner attitudes. So people who didn't like foreigners, or still don't, people who don't like foreigners, they would be considered xenophobic, or they're afraid of foreigners. The other pattern of behavior and thought that emerged is nativism, blaming immigrants for the problems in the country at the time. That's a trend that sometimes still happens today. Sometimes people will blame immigrants or blame people who are newer to the country for problems, but this was especially true during the Gilded Age as well. This is a really well-known political cartoon, and it's one that students tend to have a problem with sometimes. So I'm going to challenge you again we're going to take through that optic and see if you can discern what it means. So the overview. Take about 10 seconds to just take in the entire picture. P, perspective. What's the perspective of the author? Can you tell? Are they American? Are they a foreigner? Do you think they've been in the United States a long time or a short time? The second P, break the picture into 4 parts. Look at the top left corner, and then the top right, the bottom left corner, and then the bottom right. T, text or titles. See if you can find any words in the actual picture. I don't believe there are any in this one, but there is a caption at the bottom. They would close to the newcomer the bridge that carried them and their fathers over. They would close to the newcomer. They is referring to the men in the fancy clothes that are standing kind of in the row in the middle of the picture. They would close to the newcomer, the man on the bridge, the same bridge that carried them, the fancy men, and their own fathers over. Their own fathers would be, you got it, those shadows in the background. So I'm going to have you try and discern what the meaning of this political cartoon is. One of the outright political acts that was an extension of the nativism and xenophobia was something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many Chinese were immigrating to the United States from through the Pacific, right? They were coming from China to ports on the Pacific, probably through San Francisco and then farther in. Many of them were coming over initially to help construct railroads. They were building the Transcontinental Railroad from from California into central United States to the Midwest. And then it was being met on the other side by workers from that side. But once the railroad was complete, many of these new Chinese immigrants went to cities, mostly on the West Coast, looking for new jobs. This challenged people who were already working in those cities or who might also be looking for jobs. So in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which is going to say for 10 years, it was supposed to be for 10 years, no Chinese immigrants are going to be allowed into the United States. We are closing our ports to Chinese immigrants. Again, it was only supposed to last for 10 years. It ended up lasting until 1945 at the end of World War II. We're going to break down this political cartoon again. There is a lot of good stuff in this one. So, the overview. Take 10 seconds and just see the detail, or just see the entire picture. This time, I promise we're going to make it all the way through our OPTIC acronym. So the O overview. We see a man sitting on a box outside of a gate that's closed. P, perspective. Can you tell who drew this cartoon? You might be able to find the author's name, but does that help you understand anything more about it? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The next P, parts. This is where you can find a lot of detail that you miss on your first glance or overview. So break it into parts. Maybe you start at the top and move down slowly, or you break it into 4 pieces like we've done before. T, text or titles. There's a lot of words in this one. We'll look through those together. On the title or on the gate are the words Golden Gate of Liberty. That Golden Gate is probably referring to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco because most of our Chinese immigrants are coming in through San Francisco. On the bag at the man's feet is industry. It's labeled industry. He's sitting on a box labeled order. So we might be able to assume that he's bringing those things with him as his luggage, maybe. There is a sign next to the gate I'm going to read to you. Notice, communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum are welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. People from China were not allowed. But anybody else was allowed. Anything else that went against our democratic ideals in the United States, they could come as long as they weren't Chinese. We start to see a lot more nativism and xenophobia, particularly towards people of Chinese and other Asian descent in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The I. What other things are going on? Interrelated things, interconnected parts. You might remember some things from world history that were happening in China around this time. You might remember from our last unit the open door policy that in the United States opened China to all trade so that they could trade there as well. You might have some understanding of some of the political events taking place in the Gilded Age, but it sometimes helps to kind of remind yourself what's going on in other parts of the world, because this political cartoon was not created in a vacuum. It was created under the influence of all these other things as well. And the last C, the conclusion. What can we conclude about this political cartoon? So some other terms that we need to be aware of. The term Americanization. Outside the United States, this term has one definition. It refers to the influence that the United States has on the culture of other countries. So, for example, when we talked about Hawaii and when American businessmen had a lot of economic interest in Hawaii, we were using it as a pit stop for our ships going from the West Coast to China. American culture started to have an influence there. That was Americanization. That was what Queen Liliuokalani didn't like. It was threatening the traditional Hawaiian values. Today, we see that in countries like Saudi Arabia. A lot of the very fundamentalist Islamic groups don't like the Americanization in parts of their communities because that threatens their cultural norms. I'm talking fundamentalist Muslim communities that challenges some of their cultural norms, that challenges some of their religious ideas, and challenges some of their things. So that's also an Americanization example. Another example of that would just be the idea that like people in other countries know what Nike is or drink Coca-Cola or eat at McDonald's. That is the spreading of American culture to other parts of the world. Within the United States, the term Americanization has another definition. We understand it typically in the United States. The term refers to the process of assimilation by immigrants. We tend to expect immigrants to come to the United States. Many times there is the expectation that they will drop some of their culture. Sometimes they intentionally drop their language or we expect people to learn English. Sometimes when people come to the United States, they want to stop speaking their language and learn English. It also refers to other cultural assimilation by immigrants. So they're adopting of our kind of American culture, even though there isn't a true American culture that applies to all of us. So to kind of recap our immigrants, the text on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty is, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Emma Lazarus. The United States is built on this idea that immigrants can come and make something of themselves. But that's not always what we offer to them. That's not always what's offered in our political policies, in our economic policies, and in some of our both overt and covert actions. So let's see how that kind of extends to cities. Urbanization. During the Gilded Age, in many parts of the world, not just the United States, urbanization, or the growth of cities, was really, really quick. Cities were growing so fast that the building couldn't even keep up with them. People were moving to cities when agricultural work was becoming more industrialized. We see the emergence of more farm equipment, so less workers are needed on a farm. Those people still need a job, so they move to cities to try and find some kind of manual labor. So some of the problems in these cities is overcrowding. Too many people moving to a city too quickly. It can't keep up. That's going to be really connected with crime. If there's not enough resources, if there's not enough food or housing or water or jobs, it's going to lead to crime. When people can't get what they need to support themselves and their family in a traditional way, many times they will look for non-traditional ways to get the same goals. So that leads to crime. Disease. With people packed together so closely, you're going to have the spread of disease. That's why right now we're all social distancing. I'm going to challenge you also to look at this picture. I break down this picture a lot in class. There's a lot of dirt in cities, especially as they were growing so quickly. I already mentioned there was no building codes, so a lot of times there was no indoor plumbing. It was common for children to relieve themselves or go to the bathroom just in the middle of the street. Streets were built, and still are, in a convex shape, just like our football field or a soccer field is today. It's higher at the top, and it kind of curves down at the edges. And we put curbs there and gutters so that water that hits in the middle will go down, right, and take all that dirt down. So those edges of the street along the curbs, pretty dirty. Not only might there be human waste, but I also see some animals in this picture. There would be animal waste in there as well. All of that carries a lot of bacteria, which leads to disease, especially when you have people in such tight quarters. Poverty. We've already touched on a lot of the immigrants were living in poverty. Many of the natives who were living in cities, or natives, people who had been in the United States longer, many of them were also living in poverty. That was not unique to just our immigrants, although it did affect them more strongly. Living in poverty, not enough work to go around, and the pay was really low, which is going to lead to exploitation. If you are desperate for a job, if you are desperate to provide for your family, for food, then you might end up overpaying. You might pay more than you can afford. You might, someone's going to exploit you. Someone who has power is going to use you because they know how desperate you are.